I get to go to track one later on and do a talk, so I'm going to be
okay, yeah.
unfaithful.
That's cool. You started recording.
Yep, that's what it says.
Okay, should I get started then?
Yeah, well, Mark, will we
get started
and a welcome and introduce Isabel?
I guess we should, for the benefit of the recording, if nothing else.
Yeah, let's do that.
Okay. Well, hello, I'm Mark. I'm an Azure MVP. I have no job title. Nobody has ever given me a job title, but I generally do something in between development and cloud solution architecture, depending on who wants me to do what at any particular point in time. And I'm in Northern Ireland at the moment.
Nice. I'm Lisa Clark, and I will be your host for Track 3 all day today, because I have nothing else to do since we're in lockdown. I work for Dell Technologies, and I work in the Azure Stack product group. So I'm responsible for driving the Azure Stack business across EMEA, and I work in the group of engineering technologists. So a big warm welcome to everyone to the Global Azure virtual event for UK and Ireland. First up for our talk, and I see some people joining, excellent. So our first talk of today is by Isabel, and she'll be taking us through tips for API security for developers. And I'm looking forward to it. If everyone could stay on mute, and if you have any questions, pop them in the chat, and myself and Mark will pass them to Isabel at the end for answering.
Fantastic. So good morning to you all, wherever you are. I'm actually talking to you from Spain, Madrid. Sunny, beautiful day here, to be in lockdown as well. And we'll be talking about API security, which is the core of what I do as the field CTO for 42Crunch, which is an API security company, which I co-founded about 3 years ago now. So the goal of this presentation is really to take you through what are the key issues around APIs from a security standpoint right now, and give you some real example of breaches and how to why those breaches happened, what did those companies do wrong in a sense, or forgot to look at, or simply let slip through. And make sure that it doesn't happen to you, giving you the proper remediation and approach to actually avoid this kind of problems, right? So before we get into breaches and understanding what happened to those companies, first let's start with how do we secure API? What does that mean to secure an API, right? And really, security for APIs or anything else is really a layered approach. You have multiple layers of things that you have to secure. In the case of APIs, even if you're like entirely virtualized and everything is in the cloud and everything, somewhere in a data center, there's still a machine, a physical thing. And that physical thing needs to also be secured at the operating system level, at the network level, also of course, from physical access to those machines. That's all very well managed and everything. And that's not what we're going to talk about today, right? Now, on top of those machines, you have virtualization, because you don't get access directly now to the entire server itself. You have some kind of virtualization layer on top, some kind of hypervisor, it can be Docker. On top of Docker, it could be Kubernetes. There's a lot of different, virtualization systems. And again, at that level, you will have to apply security measures as well, just to make sure the hypervisor itself doesn't get compromised, right? So that's another layer of security you'll have to put there. On top of that, you have communication. What's called communication is really about, so let's say you have an application that have a lot of different services and components to it, right? So in that layer, this is where you're going to secure the communication between those different components. So let's take a microservices example, right? Because this is where we have small components that have to talk to each other. You will have a microservices A and microservices B, C, D, E, many of them. How those services will talk to each other. Who can talk to who, right? If I have a backend microservice that's dealing with data, most likely I don't want any microservice dealing with UI and front end to be able to communicate straight into that one. It will have to go through another layer, which is more like a processing layer, just to make sure I cannot, through an API, for example, go straight into my corporate database, right? So all of this is at the communication level. This is where you're going to find solutions like service meshes, for example. Like a service mesh, the role of such a component is to manage easily for you all this intra-services communication and manage whether those those communications are encrypted through TLS, how does the authentication between those different components happens, and how the authorization happens. So that's a communication layer. Now, and this is a place where you'll have a lot to work to do in terms of making sure you cannot navigate within your application the way you want. It has to be controlled, right? But there's still another layer on top of that. That's the one we're going to focus on today, which is now the app itself, right? So the code of that app, the libs that you use, the data that you access. So this is all about the microservice itself, if you want, or the API itself, or the service itself. How do we apply security at that level, right? And really at that level, what we want to manage, what is application level security, right? So it's all about validating that the data, the payloads, the information that flows through my API is really what I'm expecting. Is it the data that I'm receiving? Is it really in the format I'm expecting? Does it have any things I'm not expecting in terms of data, in terms of extra data, of missing data, of the format of the data? So that's all about inbound. Usually that's the first thing we kind of worry about, is making sure somebody is not sending us some bad data that will trigger some bad behavior of our API, right? But also the other way around. How do we ensure that we don't leak some data? And we will see some good examples of that in the breaches I'm going to talk about, right? Or making sure that we don't leak some exceptions. So leaking exception is always a bad thing, because it's something that reveals a lot about what's happening and the implementation of your API, which really should be a total black box and should not be something that external consumers or hackers should be able to know about. So how do we ensure this is not happening? How do we make sure that the token that we use to access our API are actually the ones that we also expect, that nobody has stolen a token and is replaying it, forged a token and is using it. So before we allow to even use that access token for authorization or authentication to the service itself and access to the data, we have to first validate that it's actually the one we're expecting. And finally, at the data level, right? How do we authorize access to the data? So at the communication level I was talking about before, there is some authentication authorization happening, but it's really about whether service A can talk to service B. It doesn't know anything about what service A is doing or what service B is doing, and which data those two services are actually manipulating. At application level, we do know, right? So we know that users have IDs, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, right? So how do we make sure that, as Isabel, I actually have access to a resource with this ID? So we're really here at data level, and that's only known at the application level, right? So this is what we're going to focus on today. Now, how does this fit in the Azure story and what we do as well, right? So typically, to do this kind of application level security, you have two main pillars of it, right? You have API access control. This is typically what something like Azure API management would do. This is the place where you're going to govern how you access your APIs, issuing tokens, doing this authentication level at data, right? The authorization, manage identities. All of this is happening inside such a product. Where we focus more is on the threat protection, right? Which is another pillar of that. Typically, this is the type of work that a firewall is doing. So in our world, we have something we call an API firewall. But basically, the role of a firewall, the same way you have a network firewall to ensure that packets are the ones you're expecting and you can open certain ports, etc. You have the same thing at the application level, where we can look at the content and understand that content, look at those tokens I was talking about, manage the traffic, maybe look at the payloads themselves, so the requests and the responses, and be able to sign and encrypt them for additional security. And this is where we're going to detect those threats. I use all this information of all the requests coming in and out to actually detect some patterns and block somebody who's trying to maybe abuse our logging operation on our API, for example. Right. So that's kind of the overall picture of application security. Now, for security, we need principles. We need some guiding principles, right? And the first guiding principle of security in general, and API security, application level security in particular, is a zero trust architecture. What does that mean? It's a kind of an overused word, and a lot of people are talking about this, but from a principle point of view, it means we don't trust any information coming our way, any request coming our way by principle. So it doesn't matter if I discuss it with customers all the time and say, well, if I'm in a microservice architecture and I'm developing a microservice and my buddy Joe next to me is developing another microservice, right? I'm going to trust that one, of course, because it's written by my buddy Joe and I know him, and he's not going to try to abuse my microservice, right? So maybe we trust Joe, right? But what about another microservice that maybe we're consuming from somewhere else, or that's not been written by us or anybody in the company, or who knows, right? So if you start putting some exceptions, saying, well, now we're going to trust it because A, B, and C, then you're going to try applying different rules and to things that are going to trigger. It's very easy then to have conditions and exceptions that are going to become the entry point for problems, right? So it's much easier to just say, by principle, there is no trust, right? We don't trust any of the data. It doesn't matter who is actually invoking us. By default, we don't trust that that call is made by somebody we trust, right? So it means we always verify the contents, we always verify the authorization, the authentication. There's always SSL, etc., etc. And it's all the same, right? So apply the same principle and the same security principles across the board. Then what I mean by all APIs are open APIs. What really that means is, again, let's not make a difference between, oh, but my APIs, they're just consumed internally. And that's okay, right? Because we're internally, we trust everybody within the company. So nobody is going to abuse those APIs, right? As opposed to, oh, this is an open API that I'm exposing to the internet or even to partners. So it's not only an internal consumption. So in that case, people understand more and say, oh, yeah, of course, there is more risk there because I'm opening it to the outside. And again, let's apply the same rules to everything, right? Should you have internal APIs, external APIs, partner APIs? Let's secure them and follow the same principles of security across all of them. Let's not make exceptions, because if you start again, same principle as before, making exceptions, then you're going to open problems. And this is where, you're going to open the door to problems on certain APIs and not others, etc. Now, this is to that principle number 2, we have to add something else, which is risk, right? So of course, what I'm not saying that you should just consider all your APIs exactly the same from a security standpoint and apply the highest security standards. That's okay if you want to do that, but really what you should do, there's a cost to high security standards. It's the same thing as putting, if you have a door to your house and you put 10 locks on it, right? There is a cost to that, which is going to take you 10 minutes to open your door. Yeah, it's very secure. but it's, you have a lot of, or if you put some, I don't know, some fingerprint system to read your fingerprint before you can get into your personal house. Do you want to do that to enter your personal house? Maybe not. Do you want to do that in the data center where all my systems are in Azure cloud? Yeah, probably, and more than that, right? So the security principle is still that there is a door to enter everywhere. Now, the way to open that door is actually different depending on the risk, right? So you need to do the same thing for your APIs, depending on the risk. So if you're a banking user, right, and you're manipulating sensitive data, or you're passing money from one account to another, then that risk of this API being abused is obviously higher than if you're the weather channel, right? And you're manipulating weather data, which is, we can say, insensitive in the sense that, if somebody steals it, well, you've stolen the weather data, okay? And usually, fortunately, this is only in read-only mode. We cannot change the weather yet, and hopefully we'll never be able to do so. So it's, it's not the same risk, because the data you're manipulating has less sensitivity. The operations that you're doing have less sensitivity. So you need to know your APIs. I guess this is the key message here. You have to know your APIs. You have to know what they're doing. You have to know the data that they're manipulating. And based on that, you're going to adapt the security on top of them based on that risk. Okay. Now, those principles, they're going to help us protect APIs that have really evolved, the applications, I'm sorry, have evolved a lot in the past 10, 15 years, right? We went from a security architecture, which is very much like this, this picture you see now, where in ancient times, when we're building a city, there was the core of the city, which you see on the picture, and there will be walls and walls of protection, right? And 3, 4 walls plus the door plus water and boiling oil and whatever it was when this was under attack, just to make sure that if the first protection was falling, there was still another level and another level, right? And it was perimeter protection, right? So you would put this wall around yourselves and protect the perimeter. Now the perimeter is pretty much gone, right? So rather than having, this wall with one very single door, which is very well-known door, and that's the only way to get in, you have those multiple walls you have to pass to get into the inside. Now we have this one thing in the middle, which is still the heart of our system. And we have dozens of avenues coming into it. And every time you open an API, you open a new avenue. It's like you open a new road to get into the Arc de Triomphe here in Paris, right? So it's not about, which means that the focus now has really changed. The focus of security is not about securing the perimeter. It's about securing the data. It's all about accessing the data and securing the access to that data, right? So you cannot just build more walls because you're punching holes all over the place through that wall anyway. To talk to external APIs, to create your own APIs. So, the principles have changed very much, right? So, what also is specific about an API-based application is there are some specific threats attached to them, right? So not only has the perimeter changed, and the way we do security is changing, the way we do applications is changing. And all of this is kind of moving at the same time. And, within the next probably 5 to 10 years, every single application that we know today will have a backend which is based on API. It's still not true totally right now because we have a lot of history and things we cannot change, right? But all the new applications certainly are built this way, right? And when you create an application with APIs, basically what you're doing is you're exposing, again, you're punching all those holes in this perimeter, right? And you open all those avenues for people to come in. So this is becoming now, and it has really started to pick up in the last 18 months, And as you know, Gartner is saying, it's going to continue and increase over the next 2-3 years. This is becoming the number one, attack vector in the enterprise now, for small and large companies alike. So as 42 Crunch, we're curating this website called APIsecurity.io, which really is a community effort to educate people about APIs and about API threats, report problems, so that you can learn from others' mistakes, what we're going to do in a second, and not repeat those mistakes yourselves. But if we look across, those 200 plus breaches that we have reported in the past year and a half, pretty much, the same problems come back again and again. Lack of input validation. This is back to my story about trust, right? It's like we trust that the data that comes in is actually valid, so we don't validate it, right? And therefore, that's how, we accept information we actually should not accept. And this has been going on for like 20, 30 years, since the beginning of applications, I guess. And it's through the applications that we tend to it's very easy not to validate what we receive. Bad security configuration, I'll give some examples of that as we go along. Broken authentication, broken authorization. So those are the main issues, and we'll talk about some specifics right now. Now, about 9 months ago now, the OWASP has recognized that, APIs-based application is not the same as others through the release of an OWASP top 10 for APIs. So I'm sure you all know about the OWASP top 10 for applications, so, which has been there for a very long time. And doing this specific list for APIs, what the OWASP is recognizing is there are a number of threats which are specific to the fact that we architecture our applications in like, let's say, a fat JavaScript type client and APIs in the backend, because we, again, give straight access to data and processes through those APIs. So we'll go and talk about some of these as we talk about the breaches specifically, okay? Which is where we're getting now. So real stories and lessons learned. So this is really about real things that have happened, and how they relate to the OWASP top 10. So the first one I wanted to talk to you about is something that happened about 2 years ago, almost 3 years ago now, time is flying, to T-Mobile, but it's really like a book example. So one thing, as you see on the right here, I have A1 to A10, and some of them are in red. This is to show you the combination of problems that have happened here that made that breach possible, right? And this is also a very key lesson. In most of the breaches I'm going to talk about, or the problems that I've been reported, you will see it's very rare that a massive breach happens just because of one problem in the 10. It's usually a mix of 2, 3, 4 problems, so that one vulnerability is used to obtain some information, and another vulnerability is used to exploit the information that we have found. So in the case of T-Mobile, and on each of those, you have this vice.com for the article here below. You will have the presentation later, so you can go and read more about this. But basically, at the root of the issue here is I'm a user. I can connect to an API from T-Mobile, and I have a token. So I have a valid token that I have obtained in a legal way, which allows me as Isabel to go and invoke this API and get the full profile attached to my phone number, okay? Now, the problem is I can also put the phone number of Lisa and I'll get her profile. Right, and why is this happening is one of the top problem called, you may have heard something called IDOR in the OWASP API top 10, they call it BOLA. So it's this broken level authorization. Basically, the idea is the source of the issue here is twofold, right? The first one is, because of course this is a phone number, the ID of the user is a very well-known format. So it's very easy to generate phone numbers automatically, which is exactly what the hackers have been doing. They've been just exploiting this by getting a token and then having something that would just generate phone numbers automatically and see if the API would be answering some profiles. And that way they have retrieved millions basically of profiles of numbers, right? So the source is one, I have a user ID, an ID, which is guessable. So I can iterate on this. So if you have an API that uses, an ID called 1234, then I can try 1235 and see if that works, right? So that's one thing. And the second thing, of course, is an authorization problem, which is that as Isabel, I should never be allowed to see Lisa's phone number's details and vice versa. So somewhere down the line, there's some logic missing to validate that I have the credentials to actually access that specific resource, right? But on top of that, two other things happen here. This API has been abused for months. There was even a movie on YouTube explaining how to abuse this API, which means they haven't seen anything for months, right? And really, this happened for two reasons. The first one is there was no really rate limiting on this API. So they were able to just do, the same way you can do credential stuffing. So try user ID and passwords found on the dark internet and try to, use them to logging into a system. If you want to be successful as doing that, the logging API really basically needs to have no rate limiting so that you can do millions of calls on that logging until they actually work and see which ones work. But it's the same thing here. They've been able to get millions of calls going unnoticed. One, because there was no rate limiting, and B, because their logging infrastructure and alerting infrastructure obviously didn't work well here. Because somewhere on a dashboard in the data center, there should have been a big red thing blinking saying, there's something really wrong going on there with this API, right? So how do we protect ourselves from this, really? So first of all, it's all about authorization, right? So fine-grained authorization. I should not be allowed to, as a user, as a system, calling an API to be able to consume data and access to data I have no business with, right? So you really want to ensure from an authorization point of view that you don't actually allow that, right? And the other one is really to have a clear separation between internal IDs and what you expose through the API. So within, you probably all have data in a database somewhere, which is using some user IDs, some unique IDs, which are yours. That's okay. So those should just stay inside your company, right? And don't expose outside those internal IDs. So you have to have a mapping somewhere between the data that's internal and the data that is actually exposed through the API. And the other thing is you can do is basically do not use the ID that the user is giving you when they make the call, but rather have them in session. So when somebody logs into the system, they get a token, probably have session somewhere, and in that session you associate the data, that they have access to. And basically when the requests come through, you want to validate through that session that, hey, that user is calling me, they're trying to access some data. That's not the data they were, allowed to within that session. So no, I'm not going to do that, right? And finally, avoids those guessable ideas. So usually the solution is to use UIDs instead, so something that cannot be guessed, so that nobody can enumerate through your API what the data is and guess what the IDs can be, right? And finally, don't use IDs at all. So in the case of T-Mobile, one thing they could have done is say T-Mobile phone management me or mine, right? And then you can say, oh, mine, what is mine? Okay, so I'm going to Isabel's profile, and that's her number. I'm going to Lisa's profile, and that's her number, because I know who they are, so you don't allow people to even use an ID. So that's kind of the combination of things you can do to mitigate such threats. Of course, you also want to put rate limiting in place. We'll talk a bit more about rate limiting in another breach that happened a bit later. Just do smart rate limiting here, that what a single user can do within a specific session, right? And what makes sense for them to retrieve. They have one phone number, probably, chances are I'm not going to retrieve my profile every 2 seconds to see if it has changed, right? This is a call that should happen once every X. So think about how what is the business, the usage pattern of an operation of an API, and put the proper rate limiting and limits based on that, right? And of course, you want to log everything that happens, right? So all those calls that come in, should they work, should they fail, especially if they fail, you want to put that into, some kind of SIEM or logging architecture that can do two things. First of all, you need this data for forensics analysis. So if something happens, you need to be able to go back somewhere and find that information. But more importantly, when it happens, you need to have some thresholds and some alerts popping up somewhere saying, hey, something is really, out of the ordinary here. The patterns of calls that usually we have here are not the ones that we see at that moment. Go and check, so at least a human can have a look at it and decide whether this is normal behavior or not. All right, so that's number one. Number two, Facebook. So this happened about a couple of years ago now, a bit more than that. So this is not a breach, because this was a bug bounty. It's something that Facebook paid for to have their API being analyzed. And here, this is the way it works. So when you reset your password, if you're using Facebook or many systems use the same system, you will be resetting your password, and some kind of token will be sent to your telephone, to your phone, for example, right? So you have this like 4 digits or 6 digits code as being sent to you, and you have like 5 minutes, 10 minutes to actually bring it in to reset the password. Okay, so that's the way it works. Now on the real API, on the real Facebook API, there is rate limiting, when we're talking back to rate limiting before, that will prevent somebody from doing like a brute force type of attack where they don't know the reset code, of course, so they'll try to guess it, right, through brute force. So basically, it's you against the machine. You have put a password reset of, let's say, 5 minutes, which means the hacker has 5 minutes to try as many combinations as possible. And obviously, with some luck, they're not going to be able to do that, and the 5 minutes will expire, and a new token will be generated. And that's the way it should work, right? Now, Facebook has a beta version of that API. And in that beta version, there is no rate limiting, right? So that's the problem, right? That's a very common issue, which is we tend to protect only production systems, and we forget about the QA and the beta, or the what we consider non-production, right? Except both the beta and the other API point to the same data. So this is not a non-production system versus a production system. It's just a different entry point, right? So the rate limiting was not there. So this is really broken authentication now, right? So now how do we protect ourselves from this, right? First is doing what I call smart rate limiting. By token, by user identity. So you have to be careful about doing rate limiting by IP. It's very easy to forge an IP, and second, it's very easy now for anybody, and that includes hackers, to create tons of little machines on their cloud platform of choice, they can just pull out a credit card, put $100, spin up 1,000 very, very small machines. They all have a different IP, and they can all attack at the same time, right? So if you do this only by IP, you're opening yourself to that problem. And this is exactly what happened to Instagram. So this is an interesting problem as well, which is very related to the Facebook one that you can have a look at as well, where they got and the same problem, and the limits and the rate limiting on their password reset was 200 attempts by minute by IP. So what's the problem with that number? If I'm a human, right? Password reset is used by humans. A human, I defy any of you here now listening to this, to try to do password reset 200 times in a minute, right? As a human, you're not going to be able to do it. As a machine, that's a different story, right? But that limit really should be for human. So maybe 3 attempts per minute or 5 attempts per minute, that's already quite a lot, right? So and plus by IP. So what happened there is exactly what I said. A hacker just again, this was like I think it was a bug bounty. Just took 1,500 machines on a cloud, give them money. It cost them $130, I think. And then because they had all those machines on different IP, and they had 200 attempts per minute, and the lifetime of the token was 10 minutes, they were able to crack the password reset code very easily using that method, right? So again, you have to think about what is it that you're protecting, and the rate limiting that makes sense for that specific operation, right? And of course, you want to put in place two-factor authentication. Maybe, even if we don't like it very much, put in type some CAPTCHA. I know that many users don't like this, but it's a good protection. Make sure your credentials cannot be stolen, and put them in some secure storage, especially if you do mobile application. Okay. And in general, to counter the fact that somebody can stole a token and reuse it, use tokens which are very short-lived, right? In our platform, the normal time is 5 seconds. Why is that? It's simply because it's very cheap to create access tokens. You can create an access token for every request if you wanted to, right? So if you create an access token on the fly to access an API, just create one, do what it has to do, and that token dies. So even if it's being stolen, you have a problem, that's okay, because they will never be able to use it, right? And also limit the scopes that those tokens have. Don't get users to create one token that gives them access to all the API and all the operations. Get them access tokens that they can generate very easily for a specific operation. So you're not using the same token to get the list of ATMs around my house than to do a payment, right? I know from a development point of view, it's a bit more work, and it's probably a bit more work on the client side as well. But it's really worthwhile in terms of security. Again, depending on the risk attached to the API, right? And finally, just from this point of view of where is the production data and from what is it accessible, right? You always want to separate non-production from production, or you put a subset of production data, you change it, you extract some information because it needs to be real for testing, I understand it, but extract some data, maybe change it, redact part of it, I don't know. But make sure it's not exploitable, basically, if it's compromised. And again, if your APIs, I work with a lot of customers that tell me, oh, you can go and call our staging API to do some testing of your platform. So their staging API is open to the world. The minute it's open to everybody, right? Then it has the same risks as the production one. So if you separate the production data from the non-production one, the risk is lower. You still have an entry point into your system, the same way your production endpoint is your entry point into the system. So you want to protect it and govern it and manage it the same way you're managing the production system, right? So don't make this separation of, oh, this is production versus non-production. So non-production, we don't have to secure it. And it's like, no, don't do that. Just do it across the board. So then there is no question. Plus, if you have put the protective measures across the board, then when you get into production, you don't have this surprise of, oh, now we have security in place, so the API is not working the same. No, if you do this from dev, then you know, and from a development perspective, you have tested all those security use cases way before you get into putting the API into production. So this is good from a testing and a validation perspective as well. Okay. Next one is Uber. So this is pretty recent one. This is just one thing. This is like a massive data leakage problem. So what is data leakage? What's the root of this? In many APIs we see, what's happening is I'm creating an API and I have all this data in my backend, right? So rather than creating maybe multiple APIs with multiple profiles for every way the data is going to be exposed and displayed, we say, okay, well, we'll just take the entire DTO in the backend, all the data, we'll just create this big JSON structure, and then the client side will do its job and will filter out what it doesn't want. Okay. So really, this is a major issue. That's the second one in that list here. The other one is this problem of leaking information through exceptions. So what happened here is, again, this is a bug bounty, okay? What happened here is somebody, the white hacker who did this, is put a driver phone number into through the driver API of Uber, okay, and is tried to invoke some operations. And as part of one of the APIs that it has been invoking, this message that you see on the screen came back, which exposed, remember we talked about UIDs 2 problems ago with the T-Mobile thing? So actually Uber here is doing a good job. They're using UIDs, those non-guessable IDs that I was talking about, to identify a driver, and that's all good. The problem is they leak it through that exception. So now I have this UID to invoke other parts of the API, and that UID is valid. Okay, so the second part of the problem was through another part of the API using this UID, the hacker was able to retrieve the entire profile of a user, including the token to authenticate through the mobile Uber app, right? So when a driver apparently, starts their day, they have to authenticate to the app, and they have to enter this token, obtain this token. Well, that token is stored together with their profile, so that got leaked as well. Of course, and once you have the mobile token, then you authenticate to the app using that token, and you're the driver, basically, right? So what's going on here? And I see this a lot in all the people I'm working with. You really have to take control of your JSON schemas, right? You have to take control of your data and describe thoroughly, and what I'm meaning by thoroughly, and I just underlined in here, is not only this is a string and this is, and then this very loose schemas I see, which are very open, where I can make data nullable, I can add extra properties to schema, so really they don't enforce anything because they're so loose that you can put any type of structure in them, right? So again, I know this is more work. It's actually more work to define this properly and have multiple schemas. So the key thing here is not to say, well, I have one schema and one set of data for everything. No, you probably will have multiple sub-schemas for the type of requests and responses. So you don't have the same schema, for example, to expose data through an API to do a get. So they may give me the profile of driver foo, right? That's one type of data, and that's one structure. Update the data of driver foo is another problem, because probably you cannot update all the same data than the one you return through the API. So those are two different schemas, right? So that's very important. And one thing everybody seems to be forgetting, while we're kind of conscious that we have to look at data that comes in, the requests that comes in, we tend to forget about the data that comes out. And that's exactly what happened here to Uber, is that the first response that comes back contains this UID, and that should not have happened. And second, the other one has like the entire profile with 170 line of JSON. That should not happen by well. So this needs to be a review. This needs to be approved. Just make sure you don't leak also GDPR information or sensitive information. There's all kind of compliance and regulation around this as well, right? That can really bite you here. And of course, you really, as I'm saying here, you really shouldn't be very conscious about the data that you're actually returning in a response. So no sensitive data, no exploitable data beyond what the client actually needs, right? So don't rely on the client apps to filter the data. What you want to do is have different endpoints, different operations that you can call as a consumer to get the data. And more importantly, maybe, depending on the consumer, you'll have a different API. So let me give you a concrete example. If I have a banking account, right? Or in the health or so, this is a very key thing in the health industry. Right? If I have an entire report, a health report on the person, right? Depending on who is going to consume this, is it my internal company because I'm an insurance company or I'm a hospital, right? Or if I'm going to open this to the world, to my patients, for example, so that they can see their own data and maybe, and I'm also sharing that with third parties because I want them to sell them some insurance through it, right? So it's the same data, but consumed by very different people. That cannot be the same API. Those are three different APIs, right? Or like the interface is very different because the schemas and the data you're going to return and how you protect it and everything is going to be very different. So you really want to, it's a bit more work, but that way you make sure you control who has access to what and which data is controlled by who, okay? If you have a single endpoint for everything, it's going to make it much more complicated and error prone. All right. And of course, we could not talk about all this without talking about Equifax. I'm sorry for Equifax that I keep talking about them, and this has been happening quite some time ago now, but it's just because it's a very critical error that has happened so many times. And it's happened to them, but actually it happens to hundreds of companies. Of course, they kind of eclipsed the news because of the mass problem here, but a lot of people got caught by this. And basically, what the root of the problem behind Equifax and many others is an Apache library from Apache's threats that went that had a vulnerability. That the vulnerability was widely exploited during months, and the fix was easy. It was just to upgrade basically to the next version, right? And many applications didn't do that. And there's two basically problems. The root problem of this is, I don't know if you can see this properly, but those 7 lines here, or 8 lines from content type to accept are the contents of the content type header, right? So if you're developers and you know this, within the content type, the only thing I should be able to put is the actual content type. So application JSON, application XML, nothing more. And look at what those guys were able to put in there, like an entire process that allows you to basically become an administrator of the system and start editing the IP tables, etc. Right? So why is this happening? Because obviously back on the on the back end, the validation of the content type is really not happening properly, right? And so what happened here is two things, right? Really, you want to keep your software at the latest level. So this is really a critical part. It's not so much about your code itself, but all those libraries and things that you're actually reusing. So being able to understand what are my external dependencies, are there on par with CVE database? Is there any known vulnerabilities in there? And there are many moving parts around this. So I really encourage you to invest and put in place some automatic system. It can be SNCC, as I'm showing here. It can be, the inbound system from Azure Cloud if you're using containers from the container registry. It can be, GitHub and the automatic security validations. But if you want to keep on top of all the things that you use, and you use a lot, you will have to put some automatic management in place here. So you want to do that for every single library, container images, all these things that you're reusing, which are not yours, right? You have to always look at them and see if this is really the latest level and whether there are any problems attached to them, right? And of course, content validation. So whatever comes in, you want to validate. And something which is, and I've seen that many times, the content type in particular, depending on the libraries that you use, whatever library it is, right? If you put a wrong content type, there's some predefined behaviors that that happen if you're not overriding them. So check that. Do some testing on what happens if I'm sending XML and I'm expecting JSON, or if I'm sending something that has nothing to do with a known MIME type. How is my framework reacting, and what type of things? Sometimes it's just, creates its own exception or creates its own response that you don't really have a control over unless you override it. So check that just to make sure what happens if the requests that comes in are actually bad ones. Okay, and for the sake of time, I'm just going to jump on this one and go straight to the conclusion. So as you can see, all those known companies have been, bitten either because they got some breaches or, through bug bounty. Now, how is this happening, right? It's happening mainly because of humans and human error. That's really what happens. And the fact that, as developers, you have to work really hard to deliver functionality, and there's no time for everything, right? And this is where I'm going to advocate very soon for automation. So now you looked at this presentation, either you're like happy under the sun and say, this is fantastic. I've done everything that was in those mitigation page. I'm all covered. I'm happy. This is cool. If you're in that case, that's fantastic. My bet is you're more in that case, which is, wait a minute, we have all this stuff that I need to look at and fix. How do I address this problem? I have like 100 APIs, thousands APIs. Where do I start, right? To start looking at all those problems. So what do you do, right? So first of all, don't panic and pick your battles. What does that mean? I'm back to what I was saying at the beginning. You need to know your APIs. What are your most sensitive APIs? If tomorrow you have a breach in your company, what are the APIs that are going to leak the most critical information that you're going to make it into the news, right? Those are the ones you want to concentrate on, right? So establish like a threat model. What are the risks? What is the data? So there's lots of, if you look for threat modeling on the OWASP, for example, there's lots of frameworks on how to do this, right? So you know what you're going to target first. And if there's one thing, that I can advocate, is that you really start worrying about security as early as possible. Many of the problems we've seen, and all the people I'm working with in my company, many of the problems they have is because they tend to look at security very late in the API lifecycle, at a point where it becomes very complicated to be efficient as security teams, to get those problems fixed before the API goes into production, right? So keep this number in mind. Whenever you find a problem in production, it's going to cost you between 15 and 30% more to solve than if you find it at design, at development time, right? So try to shift left and introduce automation, and for example, those libraries validation I was talking about. This is something that should be in place in your pipeline. So every time you push some code, automatically there's something that just go and turns and say, hey, you're using library foo at version 1.2.3. It has a problem. You have to move to version 1.2.5, right? So the earlier you discover that, the better, because of course now you can test with 1.2.5, and if there are problems because of the migration, then you can fix them right away, as opposed to, at the end of the life cycle. And then is hacking yourself. So what I mean by that is we tend to really write functional tests like this. When my API, I'm invoking it, I'm testing the happy path. The happy path of sending some data and getting some response. Now, what I would like you to do is to test the hacky path. What that means is for every single functional test that you do, you want to write 10 negative tests. Just send to your API all kind of bad data, bad token, bad user, all kind of crazy formats of all sorts. And that's how you're going to discover really how your API works under security stress. Right, and you want to automate those the same way you automate the functional tests, and just hammer your API with all kind of bad stuff as early as possible in the lifecycle of API. And of course, automation is your friend here. If you're building one API, two APIs, doing this manually, those tests, everything, okay, all that's okay. But most likely, if you're like all the companies I'm talking to, you have 200, 300, 400 APIs. And that's where manual just doesn't work anymore, right? So you want to adopt shift left, DevSecOps, maybe use your Azure DevOps, Azure pipelines to start injecting security checks as early as possible. And just consider security as early, and consider security as fully part of your API development story. Okay, and that's what I had for all of you today.
Thanks, Isabel. That was awesome.
That was great.
I really liked the point at the end there about the fact that if you find an issue in production, it's going to, cost you way more in time and effort to fix than if you'd solved it whilst developing. And I think that's a really good way to remind people how important this is, because even as people, still don't quite get it, like security is major, it can happen to anyone. But when you talk about time and effort, everyone listens.
It never seems that important until you get bitten, and then you suddenly realize.
Yeah. Indeed. Okay, so we've got two questions.
Mm-hmm.
Mark, do you want to take them?
Yeah, the first one was from Michael. He was saying, can you enforce any API security best practices using Azure policy?
Azure policy.
I suppose you could.
You could, right?
Going back to your point about keeping the different components of your APIs up to date, I suppose you could then potentially use Azure policy to make sure those components are up to date. But I don't know if it has a link into.
Yeah, I think Azure policy is more at the infrastructure level rather than the application level. So I'm not sure there's much you can do with that. I think you'd probably be looking at something more like API management if you wanted to enforce rules.
Yes, indeed. So it's more. There's two places where. So it depends. So those authorization policies that I was talking about, like authentication authorization policies, for example, that's definitely API management space, right? If you want to put in place some at the infrastructure level, this communication level I was talking about, some policies on who can talk to you, to who, what kind of information flows through, is it encrypted, not encrypted? That's maybe more at that level that the Azure policies will get into the picture.
Yeah, and the other question was for smaller customers that aren't able to directly leverage a large SIEM, SIEM solution, so security infrastructure and event management solution, and don't have a team of security data researchers. What would you recommend them to start with for logging and alerting?
A simple just logs repository, really. You have some, open source solutions that allow you to do this. And the key thing is to have them stored somewhere so you can analyze them later, right? And there's some, solutions, depends on the volume of your data. In general, the price goes up from depending on the data volume that you have. But if you're an SMB, maybe you don't have so much volume of data, and I'm sure there's some very affordable solutions which are based on open source things like Elasticsearch, where you can store all that information and keep it and use it for later.
Okay. One last question, just from my point of view. I'm always getting into arguments with basically when you get people, sort of the business people, they always have this just checkbox, is there a perimeter? Is there a virtual network going on here? And I'm always, coming from a developer point of view, saying, honestly, it's far more important to protect your endpoints. And I have this theory that, in fact, if you do your endpoints right, you don't need any of that VNet stuff, and you don't need to introduce the complication and the expense that involves. What do you think?
By endpoints, you mean API endpoints?
Yeah, basically.
Okay, because there's in the security world, endpoints are also machines. Desktops. Yeah. So again, I think the key point here is to indeed close down those endpoints as much as you can, because they're those holes that are punched and allow you to absolutely access everything. So yeah, if you secure properly that, you basically close the door.
Yeah. Okay, I'll take that as a yes, I'm right. Okay, thanks. That was great. And you have got some virtual applause and thanks going on in the chat window there. I don't know whether you can see that. So,
yep, everyone enjoyed that. Thanks, Isabel.
Well, thank you very much, and have a great rest of the day.
Thank you.
Right. Okay, so our next session, unfortunately, our next speaker is unwell and couldn't make it.
Yeah.
So what we're going to do is to, hopefully, if the bandwidth works, we're going to play a slightly different session that has been done by another, actually, I think, a mixed reality MVP. So rather than, specifically war stories of running a virtual conference, this one will be how to run a conference in VR using AltSpace VR. So hopefully that will be of sufficient interest to people.
Yeah, and I've shared the link to the full agenda, just in case you do want to swap between the tracks, and I've shared the links to the tracks as well. But thanks for joining us, guys. We'll be back at 11 with another live session, so check out the agenda.
Right, and I'll see if I can get this set up.
Have you got the link?
Yep, there we go.
Okay, cool.
Let me know if you can hear when something happens.
Hi, I'm Simon Jackson, a Windows Mixed Reality MVP. I'm here today to take you through a lovely offering from Microsoft called AltSpace VR, which is a huge virtual presence space for hosting online meetings, events, panels, discussions, or even a place just to go and chat in VR if you so wish. But obviously today, as we're focusing on all the services that are available, we're looking at how to get your online meeting or presence in there, branded, and the way you want to run. We're going to run this through from beginning to end, So everything you need to know for how to get started, creating your event, running presentations, and even how to get set up for recording. So hopefully by the end of this, you'll have an appreciation for all this, and I fully encourage you to dive straight in and have a play with it yourself. AltSpace itself is completely free. So let's look at what AltSpace is. It's a huge VR social platform, but also it has dedicated spaces for event scheduling. And in fact, AltSpace announced on their blog just this week, they're also ramping up this whole event scheduling space with a feature called Groups. As this is sort of in preview, we're not going to go through this today, but I encourage you to have a look into it. AltSpace supports up to about 80 people per space, depending on the kind of venue you do, but this isn't really a hard limit. So it's 80 people per room, but AltSpace for free, I will stress for free, will expand your space to host as many people you want, up to about 10,000 or so, by basically spinning up additional rooms and synchronize all those so everyone is in the same virtual presence, but not necessarily in the same physical room. A good factor about AltSpace is also that it has both 2D and also virtual reality clients. So if, like me, I'm using AltSpace today on the desktop, it's also got clients on the Quest, on the HoloLens, on the Vive, on the Rift, on most VR clients out there. There's an AltSpace client there for you. I find it especially good if you're using the Oculus Quest, which is completely wireless, so I can actually walk around the room. Just make sure not to lean on any tables, because you will fall over, unfortunately. And as I said, AltSpace is free. And in talking to the AltSpace staff, AltSpace is intended to remain free no matter what size your event. They're there to make sure the fact that you can have the best online experience available, suited to your needs. If we look in AltSpace, this is a shot I took earlier today. I've got a simple conference room set up, but AltSpace offers many different scenarios and settings that you can actually set your meeting up in, which we'll also go and quickly go through. So, as I said, what we're going to go through here is actually what you'll need to set up a meeting, go through all the different steps and things to get ready, walk through actually preparing or getting your meeting space ready, what you'll need to know, tips and tricks for when you're running a meeting, a little bit of information for the actual presenter for how you can actually run the presentation effectively, if indeed you are running a presentation. If you're simply having a panel or people talking, you can just talk. And also what you'll need to do if you want to record your session. Like with a lot of online meeting spaces, the service itself doesn't provide recording inside. You actually have to go through a mechanism to actually record it yourself using a separate client. As I said, we shall go through it all. So you have an event, you've got an online meeting group, and you want to suddenly take your meeting now, especially in light of today, and put that online. AltSpace makes this quite simple. It's a case of going to their website, logging in, and then simply creating an event. Anyone can do this. You simply give it a name, give it a simple description, when you want it to start and end, and give it a character creed. Now, these are usually quite critical if you're thinking about having it as a public event, if you want everyone else to be able to search for or find that using in the AltSpace client. But if it's just a simple, you want to keep it a private event for your people, then it's up to you. Once you've created this event, it's a case of you then need to distribute that event to your attendees, whether it's through AltSpace itself or simply by formulating an email and sending it out. We'll go on to that shortly. Once you've set up what it is you want to do, you then need to select where you want to go. As you can see, out of the box, there are quite a few places where you can actually have this, depending on the type of venue, the type of event you want to run, whether you'll be on the rooftop playing games, where you want an actual stage like theatre experience, or running a movie theatre. There's even things like a dance party. I'm not entirely sure, I've not been to one of those personally, or running a pub quiz. It could be anything. And the beauty about AltSpace is that you're not also limited to these spaces. If you look at the more advanced topics, you can also even build your own event space, so long as you keep within their guidelines of how things run. Once you've got your space set up, then obviously no man runs alone with these events, realistically speaking. You usually have a crew or people you want to set up. And AltSpace recognize this. So once you've created your event, it's a matter of going back and editing it as the admin, and then adding as many people as you need to help you host that event, whether that's other co-hosts, whether there are people who are actually running as moderators to simply check on people when they're in there, whether you're running a cameraman, whether you're having people who are going to go in and set up your event for you. There's a range of things in there, and you just need to explore and go through those, what those are. Most of these are fairly self-explanatory. All right, so if you go off to the Altspace website, so here we are. I've logged into Altspace as myself, and here you can see I've got already one event up with that. We're going to set up a quick new event. I'm going to do schedule, and as exactly as we've shown you, I'm going to give it a name. All right. I'm going to give it a date. Let's say today, and a little bit later in the day. Yeah, and we'll run that till. Now the timing is interesting because what this will state is that this is the time your event will be open from and close. Once it's closed, people then can't rejoin the room unless you're still in the room. And then once every party has left the room, the meeting will effectively be destroyed and be finished. So we've set up a space. We're going to have a look at, let's have a look. Let's go for the Office Olympics for this event. I'm going to make this private, so it's only me and only people who actually join the event can actually see it. Then once I've created it, I can edit it. I can set up or change the location. I can add my users if I wish, and so on. And then we're simply clicking update, and that's it. My event is now running, and at that point in time, the event will become live and allow you to enter it and start editing it. So we've got our event space. We've got a nice little register space in the world for us, and there we are. So once we're in that now, we can be able to start manipulating our world that we've created. To do this, we need to go into the Altspace settings and actually enable the world's beta. All this simply does is this enables the world's tool so we can start changing content, changing the space, putting things in there that are meaningful to us, whether it's branding, whether it's space, and so on. And I'd urge you to also consult the Altspace documentation for information about the other settings. With the world editor enabled, once we open this up, we get to see all the different content that's already in the space, and then we give the options then of adding our own content, whether it's kits and information that actually come from Altspace itself, or whether it's your own, or even whether it's recommended or featured content. One thing I will highlight on the screen is this lock rotation option, which becomes critical when you're placing content, because it then decides whether the content you're placing is relative to you or is a fixed position in space. I'll demonstrate that later. So to edit adding content, we're opening the world editor. We make sure that the edit mode is actually enabled for us to actually start editing the world. We choose the objects that we want to put in the scene. If you want to put photos or content into there, that's generally located in the Mine section where you'll see photos. And if you need to add more photos and content that you've not captured already in Altspace, then you need to make sure you upload those to the website before you enter your meeting. The content that makes up Altspace comes in several different flavors. They have the Altspace kits, and what these effectively are is programmable blocks that Altspace have created, which have a range of things you can put into the scene. I'll briefly show that. We have SDK apps, so you can actually create and craft your own content to put into your space, whether that's a rotating banner, whether it's a particular piece of feature, or an interactable component. One SDK that the actual Altspace team themselves have put together is a way to have hats on your attendees. These are all personal to you and your spaces. But you can also change the skybox, which means it's the sky around your event. So if you don't like bright and glaring, you can have dark and gloomy, or whichever your heart contends. As I said, you can also have photos in there, and then there's also a collection of basic ones, which are basically either a presentation stand or a microphone stand or some other basic parameters and content, so you can fill the room with cubes if you really so wished. So when looking through this, like I said, the thing to take care of is the lock rotation feature. Use it when you need it, because it's good for snapping things to the walls in the environment, or whether you want to have it in a particular orientation or direct for you. When you're editing, ensure you've got edit mode on. If you don't have it on, you won't be able to manipulate anything. Always have a play with the placement and how you want to do it, and ensuring that if there's any pre-content you actually want ready, you need to go out to the AltSpace website before you add those. Once we're logged in, we go to our photo section. As you can see, I've got one photo that I've already taken within AltSpace itself. In AltSpace, you have a camera to start snapping pictures in the event, which is good for passing up in the collection, and you can download them from here. We're going to go to upload. Choose a file and then simply create that. And that's going to take my content and put it available for me to put in space. Oh, I can see my happy anniversary wedding photo, which is critical to my anniversary party I'm having just next week. So once that's in there, we can then switch over to AltSpace. And here we are, by the magic of virtual reality. So in here now, I can maneuver my camera, I can wander around, I can hop on the stage, have a quick talk, grab the microphone, and talk to the crew. Interesting thing about the microphone is that when you have the microphone on the stage, everybody here can hear you at the same volume. So this is like booming out, but it doesn't matter where you are, whether you're in the stage or in the back room or for the space. Pull that down. I'm going to drop the mic on the floor. They will all hear you in the same space. And you can see as I look around here, the space is made of more than just a stage. There's also a back cloakroom. There's another room outside. We could go on for ages and just look through it. But here we are. As you can see, I've got the world editor. So I've gone into menu, settings, and enabled the world's beta here, which gives me access to the actual world builder. Oh, no, I don't want to. Don't hit exit unless you want to. So that gives me the world editor. So I can start setting up my scene. As you can see, all the basics in here. So I've got basics of a browser, label, teleporter, a few other little things. Go back. We've got skyboxes for changing what the sky looks like outside. So I've got a nice purple hue at the moment. We've got the kits, which are several different collections of things here, which can be put into your environment. So I can have a bench. Let's put a bench in here, which is currently floating in the sky. There we go. I've got 2 benches, just for the sake of it. Now you notice here, if with the lock rotation on, it's not moving. So as I turn around and everything else, I've got 3 benches. And if I turn this off, it will then orientate the bench to my view. So I can place it over here. You can also use the scroll bar to make this larger or smaller. So I'm going to let people sit down over here when they're on stage, because they might be quite tired. As I said, you need to experiment with placement, because some things will appear off the ground. There, that looks good. And there. So if you look at the other things, the other thing to look for is things like photos. So you see here now, there's the photo I took earlier in AltSpace, and then here's the picture I took. I'm going to close the world editor now so I can see a bit better. And then it's a case of nice floating picture. I'm going to make it nice and large. A bit bigger. I'm going to take this and then it's going to paste it on the wall in view. And there. So there's a nice set on the wall for everyone to see as we're watching my event. The rest of this you can play with yourself for what all these features are, and you can actually put these into your scene. Let's get back to the presentation. So when we're running events, we obviously need to be able to control or manage the audience. A lot of people will actually want to try and talk or set the stage on what they're going to do. So always when you're doing these meetings, it's like you're scheduling your meeting. You're grabbing the URL for that meeting from the website, and then you're sharing it out. And we highly advise that you then craft some kind of welcome email to make sure you prep the audience for what they want to do. You need to give them that, obviously, the URL location of the event. Give them some directions to actually install the AltSpace client, preferably before the event. We'd also recommend you tell them to try AltSpace and complete the tutorial so that they know how to get around, they know how to teleport, they know how to move around. And also to make sure that they visit the site using the URL and register. Now, this is useful because it means that they don't need to come back and find the mail when they want to join the event. They can simply log into AltSpace and the event will simply appear. And also good is to give some good tips on virtual meeting etiquette. So making sure that they're raising their hands for asking questions, not to try and crowd the stage, and to generally be good participants within a session. When you're in then, and you actually have access to the host tools, so this is anyone with the role of host or moderator at the event. You can mute the entire audience, you can send them individual messages, you can amplify your voice without a microphone, which basically gives a nice booming voice out to everyone, usually to say, everyone, can you please be quiet and mute your machines? And also an option to basically stop people entering the stage if there is a stage at that event. There is also a host panel, which gives you additional features where you can control individual participants. Now, this is good for when you start having things like Q&A sections and you want to amplify a specific person or pass around a microphone to make sure that people can speak when they want to. You can also grant individuals stage access if they want to come out, and should the worst happen and there is an unruly individual, you can even kick that attendee from the event. There's also the participation panel, which is also good for allowing hand raises. So if you're expecting a proper Q&A, it's usually in panels and things like that, where you can have the audience have an option to raise their hand, and then you can click over those people one by one, giving them access to the audience, to this microphone, speaking to the event, and then muting them afterwards, and then passing it on to the next person. This is generally the same way to when you're handing a microphone around an event, and it gives a way to also queue up questions that are for the presenter. So you're going to see AltSpace give you lots of tools and things to actually run, especially a broadcast event or a hosting event, as well as general things. Now, the guidance we usually get from running AltSpace event is make sure you set aside time for the presenter to practice, to get used to the tools and get used to the environment, especially if they're new to VR. The microphone on stage will broadcast to whoever is near it. So be cares to the fact that if someone's on stage and they walk past the microphone, as you would in real life, their voice is going to boom out to everyone, which can be really inconvenient if everyone is off mixing and then you have a conversation next to the microphone. Everyone is going to hear it, so you have to be aware. You can spawn additional microphones or even a laser pointer if you wish, if you need to point around or point around the stage to where people need to go. And simply be aware, as you would for any other event, of monitoring the audience, monitoring the stage, and so on. It's also highly recommended that as you start your event, have a speaking agent to make sure you again, reiterating the etiquette for the audience, that they need to make sure they don't crowd the stage, they don't run around the space, which can be quite disconcerting for a lot of people viewing it, and to treat it like any other regular event. And be honest, open and good with each other. So here we are back in the event. You can see, have a look around. I've got a massive audience. Turn off edit mode. So we're going to see our stage. Then I've got my host tools. Now, if I had a large booming audience here, see there, I've actually got access to all the tools. They're very simple, click on, and I'm muting everyone or unmuting everyone. And then we also have the extra host panel, then moderating here. So if I went to mute myself, no one would hear me. I can go and amplify or give a megaphone to that person. I can grant them stage access, and you can kick them out unless you're a host. Can't kick out the hosts. So then we can easily look around and so we go around. If we go back to the website, and on here, if we look at our event, So you've got my filming event here. By going into it, I can actually click on the share button, and this gives me the direct URL link to this event. This will take them both directly to the event in AltSpace, and also enable to actually jump from their web client into the app straight into the event. Or they can simply, if I go back to AltSpace, while in AltSpace, anyone can actually click on the menu item, click on events, and look at interested if they've specified their preference already, and they'll see the event here to be able to simply jump to it once they're in AltSpace. There's lots of different tools and ways to actually get people into your meeting and then run it when you're there. So when it comes to presentation, there's a lot of things in here for actually to actually give the speaker or whoever's hosting the event tools and things to actually run it. Now, these do take a bit of practice because they are quite new, because most people aren't used to actually hosting or presenting virtually. The obvious easy one is if you're just having a speaking event, you can have a panel or people on stage or someone who's just talking to the audience. If you're using some slides, and these are static slides, there's no moving pictures and things, you can use things like Google Slides, or you can even use their browser that's on there for showing different things. Well, what AltSpace VR recommend is that you use slides.com. This is a free service. There are paid tiers as well, which gives an all-round presentation solution to handle content you want to give out. And what really sets it apart is that it also has a remote control option. This becomes very useful for when you're in things like AltSpace, because if you don't want to keep turning around to look at the screen to move the slides on, you can do this remotely and having your phone connected to your slides, or even having a second person working with you to move slides along if you haven't got access to it. Lastly is the fact that you can have browser streaming apps, as a lot of things in AltSpace today are browser based, so that they're accessible to all, and also people can look at that content both within the session and also out. A nice little caveat to note, both Google Slides and slides.com both support importing PPTs. So you can write your entire presentation, like I have done today, in PowerPoint, and then publish it to those services. Or you can simply use those services to create the presentations within them themselves. The choice is completely up to you. When we look at the big screen and what we have available, we have the main screen to the left, where highlighted on the bottom left, there is actually an option to open up the browser bar. Clicking on that gives you access to the actual browser bar of the main stage, and you can just type in it. This is not very user-friendly, but is there to use as a last resort if you so wish, but it's keen to know that's there. What I really recommend is actually using your personal browser. So from your AltSpace menu in the top left, you can actually activate your browser. You need to then navigate that browser to where you need it to start. And what I highly recommend is that you get it to the point of when it's ready to show. So that includes if you need to have any video full screen, you need your slides presented ready, because once it's on the stage, it's a lot harder to control. Once you're ready to then broadcast it, if providing you're in an environment that supports this, the broadcast icon will appear in your tools bar on the bottom right. Clicking on this gives you option to then either beam the images from your browser to the stage. Be aware this is kind of slow and it's only really good for static content. So if you have just slides, again, you can just send them to the screen. The advantage here is that you have a window in front of you and you can control your presentation from a hidden control panel right in front of you. This is useful using things like Google Slides or browsing on something that you need to be able to like click on. If you're using something like slides.com, you don't need to. You've also got sync URLs, which basically takes the URL of the browser that you're currently looking at and simply sends that to the screen, which replaces the browser view that you saw earlier. This is where you use it more commonly, where you start your presentation, you put it up there, and then you're going to run. Then obviously you get the option of whether it's going on the wall or whether you're spawning a new browser window right in front of you that everyone else can see. Obviously, for most cases, you're just going to put it. Additionally, there is also a sort of a picture board that's behind the stage, and you'll see these there. You'll notice that when you click on these, it only allows you to put photos on. So it's a simple way to have a fixed location where you can actually put images onto a wall. Obviously, again, with the SDK within the AltSpace, you can craft your own of these for hosting in more places if you want to really personalize your space. Just be aware that if you need images that are not in Altspace already, from the website, you need to then upload those into your account so that they're available for actually posting into the event. So here we are again in Altspace. So as you can see, if I move around, I've got access to the actual browser window here, and I can go and type in any address. Pray that those YouTube is being nice to us today. Yep. And we can view content and interact this as we wish. There are a few limitations with using sites like YouTube for video. Let's have some ambient music there. Is that you have trouble accessing pop-ups and things like that, but also you must be into content mode. Also to note, stop that. There. Is that once it's on the stage, if the audio is not enabled, you can't do so from the screen. It gets rather tricky. This is where we start using a personal browser for accessing these services. Now this is a window like anything else. If you open up and if I move around, it actually stays there in place. If it stays there in place, I simply need to be able to select the personal icon, and then this window will actually follow me around. Or if I'm presenting on stage, I can walk over here, place it in front of me, and then dock it. And the interesting thing is this is my personal browser. No one else in the audience can see it. So it's very useful for them synchronizing or changing what these things are. Now if I go to Google, I can do it there. And then when I'm ready, I can then broadcast it. Again, using either Beam or Sync URLs, and put it on the wall and send it. Now if you sync URLs, you lose your window because it's now up on the wall where it's being run from. So all the content is everything else is being run from there. Now what I recommend is you use slides.com if you're doing any kind of presentations, especially if you've got mixed content. But there's a bit too much to go into slides.com today, so I suggest just going to the site, reading through their documentation, and it's as simple as browsing to the URL of your slides on both your phone and on into Altspace, and their presentation will just run as normal and allow you to click forward, back, and running your session as you wish. And obviously make sure you're speaking, pick up the mic if you wish, and then at the relevant time, drop the mic and walk away, as we usually do. As always, I recommend to make sure you have at least 10 minutes or so practice before a session to make sure all your setup is right, as you would do in a normal in-person event, by getting all your PC and kit ready, make sure all videos are prepared, make sure your slides are running as you expect, so they have no surprises on the day. What about recording? Now, every single individual that's at the event effectively has a screen or window into it, and most people are just there watching the event. But to record, what we need to do is actually set up a special user. Now, fair warning, you do need a separate machine for this. So you need another client that you can set up all your recording software and everything else on there. So what effectively is yet another user. They have a special role. And also, as we go into it, they also have special settings when they're in there to make sure it's all full screen and nothing's in the way. Where it simply comes down to is that we create a special account as well. We call it like an event camera for your event. Make sure the name is unique, so no one's going to look at it and try to friend it, because this is simply just a bot. It's a thing in your event that's going to look out and like to record. You set up that user as a pilot, so they have also the ability to then fly in the event. This is something that's only given to special users or hosts when they're in the event to actually move around. On that PC, you then need some kind of screen capture software, either the OBS Open Broadcaster, or use the Windows Game Bar, or whatever your favorite video capture choice is. It's a simple screen of it's going to start up Altspace, record the screen, once it's in position, and that's it. It doesn't get much difficult than that, but it does require you to have your own client. We simply go into the event, log in, and go into that event as that user. We've positioned here, so I put my cameraman up in his camera booth, and on the side you can actually see then what his view is of that. If you want to get a bit more advanced, what some events do is that they actually have an operator on that camera, so it can move around, zoom in, zoom out, and focus on different things as you do. But in most events, a static camera is usually sufficient. We also recommend using this on like a 2D client, because obviously recording in VR can get a bit flaky or temperamental at times. So once you're ready to record and your camera's in place, there's a special setting for the cameraman, which enables the Jimmy Cam, which just means you are a cameraman, effectively. And this disables all of the UI in AltSpace VR that you can see, so that you have a clean view of the recording. You then target your recording software at that window, check the audio is ready, and then hit record. And as always, like anything else we're recording, we recommend you do a quick dry run beforehand with the presenter or just members of the space there to actually play and try and see how it goes. So we're looking here, so I'm going to pretend I'm logged in as a cameraman, because it's a lot of time to actually log out, log back in. We'll go into our settings. And in input, we enable the option to fly. So this user now can actually fly around. So if I go ahead and I can just way up into the air. There we go. I think that's a nice view event. If you're using a mouse, keyboard and mouse, then on your middle mouse button, when you're looking around, will zoom in. So we can zoom straight in on the stage if you wish. Move around to when you're ready. And then in your settings again, in the items section, I'm going to enable the Jimmy Cam. That disables all UI, everything else. You can't really move around as such. You know, we can look around, we can zoom in and out a little bit more incrementally. And then we just keep the camera there steady, and that's it. And then set the recording going, and off we go. You then record that to your local machine, and then you can publish that or even stream that up to another service if you wish. If you're using something like the Open Broadcaster software, that's perfectly tuned to both recording locally and even streaming the event if you want the event streamed to things like YouTube or Mixer or Twitch. And that's it. That's a wrap, as it says. So this is everything you need to know about actually getting your event set up, communicating with your audience with what the event is and how it's working, and then running your event and getting the recordings. Few last little tips and tricks around running space. As these are virtual events, and as you would in an in-person event, try to have some help. You can do this as a one-man person, and it can work as you would like it. But it's also better to have help, especially when you're setting up different machines. Make sure you've got a dedicated machine for doing recording, if that's what you want for your event. And as always, we highly recommend that you start the meeting when you're getting ready, even as, again, you would in an in-person event, to give it like basic etiquette around how people should run in an online event. I've lost count of the amount of events that haven't done this, and then especially new users will wander from around and they sort of make a disruptive influence to the rest of the audience who are just trying to watch it. You wouldn't expect it in an in-person event. Don't accept it in an actual online event. Also, good is to also make sure that you have like a virtual bar afterwards, so everyone can run around. And the beauty of this is that everyone can split off like they can in any other event, go and talk. They can queue up to go and talk to the presenter and have it running as long as they wish. But key thing to note, and especially this comes down to your timings of your event, that once the end time of the event finishes, the event will still stay open as long as there are people in the room. But people will not be able to re-enter the room unless they're pulled in by someone at the event. This is quite clear, especially if someone needs to drop off and they need to come back. You need to make sure that there's a way of getting people back in if you wish, or simply extend the times beyond what it is. You've got no limitation for time. There's no additional cost. You could have the meeting run for 3 days if you wish, for just a fun meet and greet place to people to go back in. It's completely up to you how you run these events. And for more information, here's a nice list of URLs, give you access to the AltSpace, the blog, a one-on-one event, which is great for new users, and introduce them to how to work in the environment and also all the features around the AltSpace event. Links to the Open Broadcaster software, which is what I use for recording sessions, or in the Windows Game Bar, which is a handy little tool which comes built in with Windows 10 and is also available on the Windows 10 store. And it's simple as hitting Windows key G and hitting record, and it'll simply record your screen. I've been Simon Darkside Jackson. You can find me here at these places and find more information on these things. And I shall no doubt be following up with a more in-depth review of some of the more advanced features, especially around the SDKs and other beta features as they become available. So thank you for watching.
Right.
Who do we have currently in the event? Let's see.
Yeah.
We've got some people. Okay, cool. So guys, just in case you missed it, our original speaker was unwell, so we had to play. Luckily enough, we have lots of recorded sessions, so we played one for you there. It's about 20 minutes until our next live session. Our next live session is Customer Management at Scale with Azure Lighthouse with Jonathan. So he'll be up at 11. Until then, shall we take a look at let's take a look at the agenda, just in case anybody isn't sure whereabouts to look for that. Oh,
Yep, that's up.
is that okay? That's the wrong.
Yeah, that's the boot camp site there now.
Excellent, thank you so much. It's strange. There's not like a line around the screen to tell me that it's. There's a little notification at the bottom. I see.
Yeah.
Okay, so where are we? We're currently here. So the next session up on track 1 is a hybrid Power BI session, which looks pretty cool. The next session on track 2 is rebooting your data strategy with the Power Platform in Office 365. And then, as I said, our next live session here at 11 is Customer Management at Scale with Azure Lighthouse. Talking about how managed service providers can administer services across dozens or even hundreds of customers' subscriptions. Actually, I'll be super interested in this because I used to work in the managed service provider space, so that's excellent.
Yes, it's the sort of thing that I avoid like the plague, is that sort of thing.
Yeah, I tell you what, it's not easy, but I think it's very rewarding, and also I think that managed service providers have such a massive opportunity.
Oh yes, I'm very glad they're there. Yeah, basically I can do the things, I can set it all up nice, I can give them the stuff, and then they can go and manage it.
Oh, okay, so it's the whole management and dealing with the customer thing that you.
Yeah, that's not my bag. So.
Amazing.
And Azure Sentinel. Oh yeah, Paul. That's a bit.
I think. Yeah. Cool. So the other people in the chats, are you guys guests? Are you guys speaker? I see that we have Duncan there. He's speaking.
Yeah, Duncan's a speaker. Alan is Alan.
Yeah.
I don't know who Craig and Jolte are. But
Yeah.
Feel free to unmute and say hello. Or
yeah, Duncan, do you want to pitch your session for later on?
They may not. They may have wandered off for the next 20 minutes, of course.
Yeah, that's very true. Very true.
Just getting the queue, getting the space at the front of the queue.
Yes.
What's in the chat?
Okay, Craig and Jolt.
Oh, yes. Craig is just a guest and Jolt is just a guest. So,
where are you guys based? Liverpool. Oh, that's not too far from me. I'm in Dundee in Scotland.
I'm from Manchester, so I'm going to ignore that.
Oh, yep. Budapest. I was meant to be going to Budapest at the end of May.
Yeah, it's somewhere I've always wanted to go.
I've always wanted to go to Budapest. It looks beautiful. Me and my friend had flights booked for the end of May, but we won't be going probably. So yeah, we need to reschedule that. I used to be able to drive to Manchester in 4.5 hours without stopping. I used to work in Manchester, actually.
All the way from Dundee.
Yeah, so I used to work in Manchester, and when I was driving home to visit home, I would basically try and either drive the whole way without stopping, or I would wait until I got across the border so I could hear a Scottish accent, and I know that was near home.
I've done a similar drive because my daughter's actually at university in St Andrews, which is obviously just over the bridge there. And yeah, my family are down in Manchester, so I actually have done the drive from from one to the other. And it's not something I would want to do very often.
No, it's not. It's not the It can be a pretty. No, it can't. There's sections that are pretty, but other sections that are just far too long.
Yeah. some nice bits around about Northumberland. If you're going that way.
Yeah. Okay, let's just have a look and see what's going on. Let's see if there's anything going on Twitter. Lots of retweets happening. Excellent.
No, I'm not getting retweets. That's probably not because I'm not tweeting. But...
I've basically teed up tweets for all of the sessions, so they're all saved in my drafts.
Oh, right, okay. That's organised.
Yeah, I've just been doing it there, to be fair, but I've tweeted out about Jonathan's session at 11, and then when that session is up, I'll start tweeting about the next session. Now, there is some chat in the WhatsApp group about pausing recording and restarting recording.
Yeah, apparently there's a 4-hour limit on the recording, so you have to stop after the 4th session and restart.
Okay.
But now might be a good time to stop and restart, and just get...
Yeah, we could do. So I just want to read through this to make sure that I don't ruin anything. Okay, so... Okay, so it seems that we can just stop and start the recording and there's no issues.
Oh, here's Jonathan. Hi, Jonathan.
Hey, Jonathan.
Hey, how are you? There's no existing talk running?
No, basically, sort of we had a sickness, illness, so we played a recording, but the recording, which was a similar talk but shorter, so that's now finished. So we're just killing a bit of time here until.
Okay, yeah. So we have a few minutes. Okay, now I'm going to frantically set up because I need to just make sure I have everything.
That's cool. I'm just getting confirmation that I can stop this recording and start again, and that it'll all be saved because there's a limit on recording time. So I'm just trying to get confirmation of that.
Sure.
Okay, you're now a presenter.
So I'm just.
Perfect, thank you. Okay,
right. I'm going to stop recording, guys. So if you need to shout and swear or whatever, now's the time. So I'm going to stop recording.